Donald Cohn, the former vice chair of the Federal Reserve, recently told the FT Economics Show the story of how during the global financial crisis, Ben Bernanke used to joke that his memoirs would one day be titled Before Japan Opens. The joke referred to the Fed's frantic weekend efforts during that period to get emergency announcements out on a Sunday night aimed at stabilizing global markets before the Monday morning bell in Tokyo. Historically, these Sunday night announcements are quite rare. Because the Fed values stability above all else, unscheduled weekend announcements are the sort of thing worth worrying about, as they tend to be about terrible situations. The 2008 collapses of Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers, the emergency liquidity injections at the onset of the pandemic in 2020, and the regional banking crisis a few years ago that claimed Silicon Valley Bank, amongst others. Under normal conditions, investors don't spend their weekends worrying about what's going on at the Fed. So when they hear there will be a Sunday night announcement, they sit up and take note. The recent silence from the Fed was shattered last Sunday, but this time the emergency was not a failing bank or a credit freeze, it was a direct legal assault from the White House. Jerome Powell, the data-driven Fed chair appointed by Donald Trump in 2018, appeared in an extraordinary video message announcing that the Department of Justice had just served the Fed with grand jury subpoenas. The threat was a criminal indictment over Powell's congressional testimony regarding cost overruns in renovations of the Fed's headquarters. Powell did not reach for the usual polite central bank code. He stated plainly that the building project was a mere pretext. The real motivation, he argued, was retaliation, a criminal cudgel being used because the Fed had refused to set interest rates based on the preferences of the president. It was a moment of profound clarity. Powell was sounding the alarm that the independence of the world's most important financial institution, a cornerstone of global capital markets, was in immediate jeopardy. The environment leading up to this announcement has been quite unusual. While the stakes in finance are high, the silence from corporate leaders has been quite telling. An article in the Financial Times this past Thursday highlighted the pervasive fear amongst corporate leaders. It quoted the CEO of a major Wall Street firm who said he had asked not to be named to avoid being targeted by the president. In an environment where prosecutorial power is being wielded as a policy tool, the CEOs have learned that even giving an opinion could have dire consequences. To understand why a criminal subpoena is such a radical departure from the norm, it helps to look at the long and often rocky relationship between American presidents and the Federal Reserve. Friction is not a new invention. Since the Fed was founded in 1913, presidents have regularly been unhappy with interest rates, and they haven't been shy about saying so. Lyndon B. Johnson provided perhaps the most famous example of this tension. In 1965, furious that William McChesney Martin Jr. had raised interest rates, LBJ summoned him to his ranch in Texas for what he called a trip to the woodshed. Legend has it that the president shoved Martin against a wall, demanding that he lower rates because my boys are dying in Vietnam, and he needed cheap money to fund the war. Despite this physical and verbal intimidation, Martin stood his ground. Eventually, the storm passed, and LBJ, recognizing the institutional importance of the Fed's independence, went on to reappoint Martin to the post in 1967. Decades later, Ronald Reagan's administration faced the challenge of Paul Volcker's aggressive fight against double-digit inflation. Volcker hiked rates as high as 20% in the early 1980s to break the back of the price increases that had plagued the 1970s. While Reagan's Treasury Secretary publicly criticized the Fed, Reagan himself famously refused to comment on monetary policy, sticking to a mantra of non-interference and ultimately allowing Volcker to finish the job. By contrast, George H.W. Bush was never quiet about his belief that Alan Greenspan's refusal to cut rates fast enough cost him the 1992 election. Before we go any further, let me tell you about this week's video sponsor, Tailor Store. A number of people have asked me in the comments where I get my shirts, and the answer is Tailor Store. They make custom clothes designed for your body so everything fits perfectly. You just enter a few details on their website, they calculate a size for you, and make a shirt that fits you perfectly. If it's not perfect the first time, they'll remake it for free. You also get to design your own shirt if you want to, or you can pick from one of their designs. Their online tool lets you specify everything: collar shapes, cuffs, fabrics, the type of buttons and monograms, so your style really shows through. For this shirt, I went with the cutaway classic collar, French cuff, no pocket, and mother-of-pearl buttons. Tailor Store have helped over 300,000 customers since the company was founded in 2003, and they ship fast, so even though your shirts are made to measure, you won't be waiting around for them. Unlike traditional retail, nothing is produced in advance. Clothes are only made after an order is placed, which means that there are no piles of unsold stock and far less waste. Because they own their own production facilities, they've removed the unnecessary middle layers that usually push prices up. If you want a more practical, smarter way to shop for clothes that actually fit, you can find a link in the description. Tailor Store is offering my viewers 25% off your order when you use the link and discount code below. It's a great way to get clothes made properly, only when they're needed, and at a price that actually makes sense. White House pressure is nothing new, but the choice of weapon this time is unprecedented. Past presidents used the bully pulpit or private harangues. They didn't weaponize the Department of Justice to threaten criminal prosecution. As former Fed Vice Chair Alan Blinder noted, while other presidents have griped, sometimes noisily, none have ever threatened a member of the Federal Reserve Board with criminal charges. This shift moves the conflict out of the realm of political disagreement and into an unprecedented legal assault. In advanced economies, this behavior is unheard of. Critics have described the use of grand jury subpoenas to influence interest rates as thuggish. It's the kind of tactic usually observed in banana republics, where central bankers don't just risk being fired for failing to provide cheap money, they risk being jailed. By targeting Jerome Powell with a criminal indictment, the administration has turned a policy debate into a fight for personal liberty. The timing and the nature of this legal assault feels less like a well-thought-out investigation and more like a blunt warning. Jerome Powell's term as Fed chair is set to expire this May, so there's no real rush to get him out. The president is expected to announce a successor within weeks, and to quote Katie Martin at the FT, we all know that whoever gets the job, it'll basically be Donald Trump wearing a mustache as a disguise. There are a bunch of people being discussed as future chairs, and my guess is that it'll be Don Jr. Eric, or, to preserve the image of independence, Jared Kushner. If the goal were simply a change in leadership, the administration could have waited for the clock to run out. Instead, by launching a criminal probe now, the White House is possibly aiming to send a clear message to the entire Federal Reserve staff and any potential successor: if you don't obey the president, you might be dragged through the courts and possibly jailed. This isn't an isolated threat. It's part of a broader campaign to bring the Fed's board to heel. While Powell faces the DOJ, Governor Lisa Cook is currently fighting for her job in a case that reaches the Supreme Court this Wednesday. While the administration claims that she committed mortgage fraud, the courts have so far blocked her removal. By keeping multiple board members in the crosshairs simultaneously, one for fraud and another for misleading testimony, the administration is creating an environment where caving to political pressure feels like the only way to survive. The cost overrun pretext is particularly transparent when compared to the administration's own projects. The DOJ is threatening Powell with a criminal indictment over a 35% increase in the Fed's decade-long headquarters renovation, a project involving the removal of toxic asbestos and lead from 1930s-era buildings. Yet at the very same time, the White House's own project to replace the East Wing with a new ballroom has seen its estimated cost double from $200 million to $400 million in just 6 months. By bypassing standard oversight to launch a criminal grand jury investigation while ignoring its own runaway costs, the administration has made one thing clear. This isn't about fiscal responsibility. It's a thuggish attempt to not just control Powell, but to send a chilling message to any public official trying to do their job for the benefit of the American people. It demonstrates that the penalty for professional integrity is no longer just a loss of status, it's a full-scale assault on your reputation, your savings, and your freedom. The cost of defending against this kind of legal assault is staggering. While Jerome Powell's salary of $246,000 per year puts him well above the average American worker, it's a pittance compared to the cost of a top-tier criminal defense. Defending against a Department of Justice grand jury investigation can easily run into the millions of dollars. For Powell and Governor Lisa Cook, the reality is that the legal process itself, even without a conviction, can lead to financial ruin. This financial pressure is made worse by what looks like a calculated effort to isolate them. The administration has used a series of executive orders to target major law firms, signaling that representing enemies of the administration could lead to the loss of government contracts or retaliatory investigations. By making it professionally dangerous for top-tier attorneys to even take these cases, the White House is essentially dismantling the right to a fair defense. It leaves independent public servants to face the full weight of the state's legal machinery entirely alone. The current crisis didn't emerge in a vacuum. It's been steered by a new guard of officials who view institutional norms as obstacles to be dismantled. Chief among them is Bill Pulte, the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency. While he carries the name of the legendary home builder William J. Pulte, his family's company, Pulte Group, has distanced itself from him. In 2020, Pulte was ousted from the board of Pulte Group after clashing with established directors. He is in many ways an heir to a legacy he has no part in managing, having spent his adult life as an online oddball and self-styled Twitter philanthropist. Bill Pulte's transition to federal prosecutor-in-chief was fairly seamless, largely because he spent years practicing on his own family. He previously accused his grandfather's widow of insider trading and blasted his own aunt as a fake Christian on a dedicated website. I get the feeling that if you can survive a Thanksgiving dinner with Bill Pulte, a DOJ subpoena probably feels like a polite thank you note. While President Trump recently told NBC News that he knew nothing about the DOJ inquiry into the Fed's renovations, the announcement came after months of his escalating public attacks on the building project. It's not unlike Henry II asking his knights, "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" about the Archbishop of Canterbury, just as Henry's knights took this expression as an order to murder Thomas Becket. Trump's public branding of Powell as a numbskull and a stubborn mule possibly signaled to his subordinates that justice against the Fed chair was the unspoken priority of the Oval Office. Bill Pulte first came to my attention not as a policy expert, but as a central figure in James Jani's video, The Cult of the Dead Stock, which was about a community of meme stock investors who clung to the hope that the shares they owned in the bankrupt Bed Bath & Beyond would somehow make them rich. Pulte cultivated this group and turned up at bizarre live-streamed Pulte Fest events in airplane hangars where attendees who paid hundreds of dollars to attend slapped each other on the face with green dildos. This was supposed to be a visual metaphor for the green candles of a rising stock price. It certainly puts a new spin on the phrase market penetration.
Pulte, look at this thing.
Pulte's Twitter philanthropy involved using Twitter to document stunts like handing cash to strangers in parking lots, giving away free cars, or announcing that he would give $30,000 to a military veteran if President Donald Trump gave him a retweet. Trump did just that, tweeting "Thank you, Bill" to his 63 million Twitter followers in 2019. Critics, however, have characterized his online presence as a series of pump-and-dump schemes, ranging from failed business ventures to dubious cryptocurrency promotions. Before taking his current post, Pulte reportedly deleted around 25,000 tweets, which some described as an attempt to hide his temperament and past policy positions from public scrutiny. Now the man from the dildo slapping videos is the director of the typically staid FHFA, where he reportedly lobbies the president with literal wanted posters of Jerome Powell. His presence is so disruptive that it recently led to a physical confrontation with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. At a private dinner in September, Bessent reportedly had to be restrained after threatening to punch Pulte in the face for badmouthing him to the president and overstepping his authority. It's good to know that while the dollar is being debased, the art of 19th century dueling is making a spirited comeback in the cabinet. Green dildos at dawn. Working alongside Pulte is Judge Jeanine Pirro, the U.S. Attorney for D.C., who has spearheaded the move toward grand jury subpoenas. To the American public, Pirro is best known not as a prosecutor, but as Judge Jeanine, the host of a long-running Fox News show where she was famous for delivering fiery monologues in defense of Donald Trump. Her transition to the nation's most powerful prosecutor's office has been described as a federal takeover of D.C. law enforcement by the president's closest allies. Pirro's loyalty has been tested and rewarded repeatedly. She was a vocal proponent of the claims that the 2020 election was rigged, a stance that eventually placed segments of her show at the heart of the $787.5 million defamation settlement with Dominion Voting Systems. Despite being disgraced in that lawsuit, she was still tapped to lead the DC office in 2025. While Pirro frames the legal escalation as a simple matter of the Fed ignoring emails, the speed of her office's actions, skipping standard inquiries to go straight to a criminal grand jury, suggests a coordinated effort. It's an attempt to attack the institutional independence of the Federal Reserve with the threat of a jail cell, moving the conflict from the realm of policy disagreement into the territory of personal survival. With the Fed's leadership under siege, the administration has begun an aggressive end run to bypass the central bank's control over interest rates entirely. In what some are calling executive QE, the president has ordered Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to purchase $200 billion in mortgage bonds. The goal of this action is to force mortgage rates down by presidential decree, effectively doing what the Fed has refused to do. This move is paired with a broader playbook aimed at reducing borrowing rates, such as temporarily capping credit card interest rates at 10% up until right after the midterm elections. While economists warn that such a cap could cause banks to stop lending to millions of Americans, the administration is betting that the immediate optics of lower rates will outweigh the longer-term risk of a credit crunch. By seizing control of these levers, the White House is attempting to shift rate-setting authority from the independent Fed directly to the Oval Office. The administration's ideas around getting rates lower relies on a form of magical thinking, the belief that the president can simply decree lower interest rates to fund a ballooning $38.6 trillion national debt. This approach treats interest rates like a retail price tag that can be marked down at will, rather than a reflection of what investors actually demand in exchange for their savings. The president is focusing on the Fed funds rate, the rate that the Federal Reserve sets, which is an overnight interest rate. But the rates that matter the most for the US budget and for American mortgages are much longer term and are set by the global bond market. This is where the Trump conundrum takes hold. If the Fed is seen as a political puppet, investors might begin to fear that the dollar is being debased. To protect themselves, they then demand a risk premium, pushing long-term rates even higher, even as the Fed tries to push short-term rates lower. To hide this disconnect, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has engaged in a high-stakes gamble, which has been referred to as activist Treasury issuance. Despite once criticizing Janet Yellen for the same tactic, Bessent has flooded the market with short-term T-bills while restricting the supply of 10-year bonds. By keeping 10-year bonds scarce, the Treasury is artificially propping up their price and keeping their yields lower than they would be in a truly free market. This is basically a big bet that interest rates will fall lower than they are today, allowing the Treasury to roll this mountain of short-term debt into hopefully cheaper long-term loans later. If this doesn't work and rates go higher, the losses will start to mount quickly. Some large-scale investors are already pushing back. PIMCO, which manages $2.2 trillion, has said that they have begun a multi-year period of diversification away from U.S. assets, citing the unpredictability of the administration's governance. If this capital flight starts to gain momentum, no amount of Treasury gymnastics will be able to keep rates low. The U.S. could soon find itself in a stagflationary trap, where low interest rates, a weak dollar, and tariffs cause inflation, and the government is forced to fund its massive deficits at punishingly high interest rates because it traded institutional credibility for a temporary political win. While the administration attempts to use these administrative levers to bypass the Federal Reserve, the battle for control has now moved to the floor of the United States Senate. The White House's strategy to replace Jerome Powell with a more obedient chair has hit a significant political roadblock, turning the selection of the next Fed leader into a high-stakes strategic standoff. The plan to install a loyalist has been thrown into doubt by Senator Thom Tillis. Immediately after Powell's hostage video was released, Tillis vowed to block the confirmation of any Federal Reserve nominee until the DOJ's criminal investigation into Powell is fully resolved. Because the Senate Banking Committee is narrowly divided, Tillis's opposition is enough to deadlock the panel. Tillis, who is retiring at the end of the year, has framed his stand as a defense of the Fed's paramount independence against what he called an attempt at coercion by the White House. This blockade creates a peculiar problem for the administration's most prominent internal voice on the board, Stephen Miran. Miran was only confirmed to fill a temporary seat that expires on January 31st, 2026. Since joining the board last September, Miran, a Trump loyalist, has been a vocal advocate for jumbo rate cuts, voting for a 50 basis point reduction in 3 consecutive meetings. He famously confirmed that he was the ultra-dove in the Fed's dot plot, projecting that rates should fall a full percentage point below the median of his colleagues. Under the Tillis blockade, Miran cannot be confirmed for a permanent 14-year term. While federal law allows him to remain in his seat as a holdover after January 31st, he remains in a state of administrative limbo, unable to be promoted and unable to be replaced. By attempting to use a criminal investigation to clear the path for a new chair, the administration may have inadvertently ensured that no new chair can be seated at all, leaving the FOMC to potentially elect its own interim leadership in May. The true cost of the war on the Fed is the erosion of what the former Dutch central banker Klaus Knot calls leading by example. For nearly a century, the US has been the leader of the free world precisely because its institutions, like the Federal Reserve, were seen as independent and objective. By turning the Fed into a battlefield, the administration is sending an alarming message to the world about the resilience of the American rule of law. The parallels are sobering. The Financial Times notes that while President Erdogan of Turkey famously sacked his central banker in 2019, triggering a plummeting lira and a surge in inflation, not even his administration suggested that the country's top banker was a criminal. By weaponizing the Department of Justice, the US has moved past the Turkey model into uncharted territory, particularly in the developed world. Harvard professor Geeta Gopinath warns that the insidious long-term effect of this siege will be to silence dissent within the Fed, leaving future governors terrified that they too could be the subject of a criminal investigation for setting interest rates based on evidence rather than political preference. The Economist provides an important historical anchor. They argue that America has coped with worse things than Donald Trump, from the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 to the repression of the Wilson era and the partisan bending of law enforcement during Watergate. The Republic has faced presidents who treated critics as enemies of the state. In each of those crises, decency and institutional norms ultimately survived because Americans chose to defend them. The current standoff with Senator Tillis suggests that the system's guardrails are holding, even if they're under immense strain. One argument against the need for independent central banks in democracies is that nothing upsets voters more than inflation, so even without an independent central bank, politicians hoping to be re-elected will want to run a sensible monetary policy to keep inflation under control. The movement towards independent central banks around the world has been on an upward trajectory since the 1950s in high, middle, and low-income countries alike. This has gone well because as independence rose, inflation fell. In recent years, especially in the wake of the pandemic, rich countries have become not just heavily indebted, but really comfortable with spending more than they bring in taxes, which means that now that rates are higher, the effect of monetary policy on government budgets has become enormous. Populists on both the left and right, like both the Greens and Reform in the UK, are pushing policies that they think would improve the budget, like taking control of the central bank and implementing policies like no longer paying interest on bank reserves. These political parties are good at stirring up voters, but a move towards political control of central banks would be a real step backwards. Hopefully we won't have to learn this the hard way. If you found this video interesting, you should watch my video on the alarming rise in global debt next. Don't forget to check out our sponsor, Taylor Store, using the link in the video description. Have a great day and see you in the next video. Bye.